Hello YouTubers, welcome to another edition of AP World History Vocabulary. Today we're going to be looking at a couple of different words in Latin America and things that were going on post-independence in Latin America. I come to you from the Teacher's Lounge today, so if it's a little bit weird in here, that's why. We're going to be looking at kind of the struggles that Latin American countries had to deal with post-independence, because a lot like any new country that becomes independent, there's a learning curve and some problems that are going to arise. And so we'll take a look at the issues between Centralists and Federalists. We'll look at Caudillos. We'll look at the Brazilian movement for independence and how that was different from most of the other independence movements. And then we'll look a little bit at at Mexico since independence and their issues with land reform and kind of conservatism versus liberalism there as well. Okay, so this is a little bit of a hodgepodge. So first of all, let's talk about Brazil briefly, because Brazil represented somewhat of an anomaly, which means they stood out for being different in their independence movement. Most independence movements that broke away from Spain, which is the majority of Latin America, did so by violence and warfare. So Bolivar and San Martin were leading forces in order to battle the royalist forces and win independence. In Brazil, there was a difference here. The Portuguese monarchy realized that they didn't necessarily want to have a war, and so they offered a deal where they would essentially put the Prince of Portugal, Pedro I, essentially on the throne in a newly independent Brazil. And so they went through a bloodless revolution where instead of fighting a war for independence, they negotiated a constitutional monarchy in order to take hold in Brazil. So that was different from most other places. In most other places in Latin America, they were battling between kind of Centralists and Federalists. So again, these are new constitutional governments, and they're new at forming republics, and they haven't really done this before. And so there's kind of two main mindsets. The Centralists kind of have the old school mindset, the conservative mindset, that the central government, the kind of the capital, should have overarching powers in order to control these new countries. So the Centralists believe that the central government should be kind of the more powerful force in laying out laws for the land. The Federalists, on the other hand, believed that kind of local leaders throughout the country should have more power on local issues, and that the central government, or the main government that was in control in the capital city, should have some powers but not broad powers. So Centralists and Federalists basically disagreed on the level of central government power, and that becomes an issue in most of these Latin American countries as they move forward, because essentially the elites, the Creoles, who had gained independence for most of these Latin American countries, wanted to maintain a power structure which benefited them, and kind of the locals, who were non-elites, wanted to gain power that helped their lives. And so Centralists and Federalists were often at odds with one another. And what often happened was the rise of Caudillos. Now, Caudillos were essentially military strongmen who gained power through military force. And this was something that was easily understood. And there wasn't a necessity of a constitution or of a strict government system, because Caudillos were basically like warlords, essentially, who controlled certain areas or regions by military might. And so this impacted the history of Latin America, because military force and power has always been seen as kind of a very important way of holding on to government power. So that was often the result of battles between Centralists and Federalists, where these Caudillos would operate their own kind of governments based on military power. Now, in Mexico, right prior to the Mexican Revolution, which is where this time period ends, we saw a battle between conservatives and liberals. Benito Juarez was a liberal president in Mexico whose attempt was to kind of redistribute land, to reduce the power of the church, to reduce the power of the elites, essentially, and to give broader reforms to to eliminate kind of class suffering in the lower classes in Mexico. Now, Benito Juarez's reforms were reversed by a conservative president in Mexico who ruled for about 30 years, Porfirio Diaz. And Porfirio Diaz was more interested in kind of maintaining economic power by reversing some of those reforms that Benito Juarez had made. So essentially, the people in Mexico began to kind of hate Porfirio Diaz. He became corrupt. He was rigging elections. People were unhappy with the way that Mexico was being ruled. And so these things led to the Mexican Revolution, which began around 1910. So the forces between conservatism and liberalism in Latin American countries would come to a head. And in Mexico, this resulted in a bloody civil war, which resulted in a new constitution in order to create modern Mexico. So there we go. That was kind of a mismatch. We started with Brazil and the bloodless revolution there and ended with the Mexican Revolution over 100 years later. But hopefully that sheds a little more light on Latin American problems in this time period. All right, be awesome. I'll be up here a little bit later with the role of the United States.